Welcome to the Pat Van GM's latest set of ramblings. This is going to be a bit off topic for what I usually do, but yet it's still a big part of, the past 15 years of my life, and I'd like to see it go further at some point. This is my mobile office, if you will. I'm between jobs at the moment, got an hour to kill because, it just is what it is. We go where customers want. It's, what is it, December 8th in Iowa. Not quite cold enough to snow yet. Was brutally cold this morning, and yet not Minnesota brutal yet. That's coming. That's coming. It still felt like it. At least the wind slowed or come to a stop. Anyway, 14, 15 years ago, I found myself with a whole lot of time on my hands, and a fella told me, he says, you got to do something to keep yourself going crazy. He said, write a book. And I kind of stared at him like he'd lost his mind. This is me write a book. Well, if you think about it, to some degree, we've spent a big chunk of our life playing or running basically interactive stories. That's what, to me, that's what RPG role-play games are, is an interactive stories. We are building the foundation, and through the actions of our characters, the players are participating in and living the story. So in reality, if you think about it, if you've done a lot of this stuff, you may have what the basic foundation skills to write a novel, to do a story. I'm not telling you that it's the easy thing to do, because, like I said, my grammar's terrible, my handwriting's even just horrific. I come from the era when handwriting was, penmanship was still a big thing in school. Now they don't even teach it. That's because my generation and the following generations have become codependent on these mechanical things here, that we call whatever you want, your laptop, your word processor, what have you. My handwriting was terrible in school. I got a lot of bad grades for it, whatever was part of the grade, and yet I still, accomplished it when I needed to get done. I was a late bloomer when it came to computers, so I didn't get my first computer until the early 90s because I drug my feet. I had some bad experiences as a teenager, young teenager, with the very early stuff where you had to program everything yourself. And I'm not a programmer. I don't pretend to be, and I don't want to be. That's just not my thing, not my bag. Okay. So the guy says, write a story. Well, it's easy to sit down and sit there, and it's far easier to create a game world and a set of scenarios for a bunch of people sit around the table and play, than it is to act as judge, jury, and executioner for this thing, this obsession that takes over at some point. And when did I become obsessed with writing? I don't know. I know that the past year has not been conducive for me for writing. I don't have the private workspace that I really need. It's difficult to do. I'm in an environment where we are in survival mode to some degree. Still waiting for my mother's house to sell through the estate, and then from there we can proceed to getting our own place, be it a house or an apartment, what have it. So it's much harder to do for some people than others. The creativity part also plays a role. I discovered when I first started writing, it was much harder for me to play devil's advocate, to play both sides of the character, because you're not writing a story I am not talented enough, or I don't like the style of the first person. I don't ever write something from my perspective. He said, I did this and I did that, and I went over here and did this. I don't even like reading those kind of books. I've tried, and there's some good books by some good authors, or potentially good books, but I can never get past the first chapter because I personally, I don't want to be in that story. I want to participate as a neutral observer, if you will. I want to be on the sidelines, which, so from my perspective, writing in the third person is the way to go. Writing in the second person, I'm not quite sure exactly what that meant. I'm sorry, I understand first person, I understand third person. The third person is the narrator per se. We're the silent observers of the characters as they go about their story. Now, from the second perspective, the second person, well, that's I always assume that that's from the other side of the I question, and it's basically the same thing. And I don't care for the semantics behind it. That's just personal preference. Then you have to come up with the story. You have to come up with a story. Now, I can come up with a lot of stories. It's another thing to carry that story through to fruition. And through trial and error, I discovered that I had to let the characters be themselves, because sometimes they will go off, your characters, even though you're doing the writing, the characters will lead you along and will take you into some unlikely paths that you never predicted in the very beginning. Now, there are a lot of people out there, would-be writers and successfully published writers, who are very analytical. They have the outline, they have detailed backstories and background bios for every character and every secondary character and NPC in their story. And kudos to them. How much time and effort it took to create all that framework before filling in, before they framed their house before putting the siding on. I get that. Okay, there's a place for it. On the other hand, I never could do it. I would get bogged down in that sort of thing, and I've always had that same problem as a game master, as designing games for people. If I got tied into or swept up into the world building thing part of the game, we never play, because I'm always trying to get that next thing, the one next best thing, and how do I explain and yet another thing. Right? So I can become very distracted in the aspect of the creation process and never actually get to the point where we need to be to create the story that we're going to share. Now, that doesn't work, of course, for everybody, but I find that a lot more people are affected by this than want to pretend that they are, which is the nature of the beast. Okay? Good for you if you're accomplished at this stuff, and you've got a goal, and you can set those blinders on, and you can focus on that thing, that thing you need to see and do, and ignore everything off to the peripheral. That's awesome. Good for you. I think a larger percentage of us don't work that way. So I still needed a story. I needed a concept. And I dug back into my gaming days, my experience as a GM and as a player, and what I like to play. And in that aspect, I did a little bit of study first, but I also continued studying my craft, if you will, all through the time that up to the present. I subscribe to Writer's Digest. It's a fairly reasonably cheap magazine that gets you get a magazine, 10 magazines a year, and it is full of valuable information, tips, and stuff to ignore. But it opened windows and got me to ask some questions that made me dig in deeper to understand things. Now, going back a bit to the beginning of this rant, as I said, my grammar is terrible. My concept of English, the English language as a written art form is horrific. That means that I have to do a lot of editing and rewriting to some degree to get where I want to be. I made the mistakes early on of trying to do that as I went along. And some people have a natural tendency a talent for that. I'm not one of those people. I also did not have access to a reliable dedicated media source. I didn't have a computer that I had 100% control over. I was sharing with other people, and I couldn't store on it at all the time. And sometimes you had to risk that other people were going to erase your stuff just because they don't know what they're doing or because they can't. And I didn't have the finances or the means or the place to acquire my own, and that really hurt. So I fell back on my handwriting, which is, like I said, bad, and I wrote. I wrote everything longhand on paper, and I wrote it on every piece of paper I got my hands on. I didn't waste any paper. If for whatever reason I didn't like what was on the front, I scratched it out, I flipped it over, and I wrote on the back. I learned, as I've said before, it's better to use plain blank paper for me than line paper, because I'll actually get far more stuff on a blank sheet of paper, because my handwriting, although messy and sloppy, is small. So I can get quite a bit of information on a single piece of paper that will stymie other people when they read it, because they can't understand half of what's on there. And yet, to me, most of it makes sense. And I'll acknowledge there are occasions when even I can't make out what I wrote. In that aspect, I read the entire structure of the sentence or paragraph and then go, I think I know what this is supposed to mean. So later, when I had access to this, that's what I've been poking away at. Now, at trying to get this handwritten stuff into a digital format. So in an aspect, it's not a bad thing, right? I made my first draft. That's what my stack of paper is. That stack of paper this thick that represents this book that I'm working on, this current project that I finished and co-wrote and finished with a friend of mine a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, is the first rough draft. And then typing that creates a second draft. Now, I forced myself not to try to edit too much of that as I go. I want a digital version of the first draft. I want as reasonably as close to the original as possible. And then I'll copy that over and go back and then go chapter by chapter and rewrite. Now, what is that? Returning full circle again to a previous comment. I started reading books on how to write. If you want to know how to program a computer, you need to read books on how to program. If you want to fix something on your automobile, you need to learn, that there are manuals for that purpose. So I read several, because there were several in the local library that I could lay my hands on fairly easy. I had purchased one many years before, and as part of one of those book deals where you buy 6 books, get 10 free kind of thing, or whatever it was, get 7 books for a penny and then buy 3 books full price, whatever it was. One of the books I picked, ironically enough, always the odds, no matter where I am, it's these oddball hours. I was up till midnight last night and back up at 5:30 this morning, because that's how we work. And I'm off for the next 3 days. Not so good. Anyway, the book I bought was called On Writing Well. I don't have it handy in front of me, or I'd tell you who wrote it, but On Writing Well. It's actually probably the most concise and best book I have ever read on the topic of writing novels. And as a matter of fact, I stumbled across a copy of it in the local library, and I reread it, and I thought, gee, I never read the original. The one I bought, I skimmed through it, threw it up on a shelf, looked snazzy on the shelf, but I never really had a reason at the time. I was writing these little blurby things for our weekend game sessions and stuff, but I wasn't going to go write a novel, so that was never in my mindset. Now, I've also read Dean Koontz has produced a book on writing novels. I've read his. Stephen King, I believe, created one, and I read his. I read 3 or 4 others that were in the library. Most of those were written by fancy professors and high school, college English, majors, who ironically in their lifetime have taught a lot of people on creative writing and how to write, but never actually wrote anything creative themselves aside from how to write a book. I kind of find that as a bit of a chagrin kind of thing. What do you do? Uh, okay, good for you. You're going to teach them how to write, but you yourself don't write. Okay. When I went to college and back in 2000, I had an opportunity and I needed a couple, what do they call them, extra classes kind of thing. So I picked creative writing and I did fairly well. But I still wasn't inspired to go off and write a novel. Like I said, it took somebody else and finding myself in a spot where I really needed to get away from everything around me and my problems. And one of those ways was to submerge myself in writing a story. And the first story I wrote was a doozy. It took almost a year and a half, almost 2 years. I have it someplace in one of the mini boxes that are in our storage locker since our last move. So I know it's there. At some point, I will get it out and do my best to move it out. But the process of writing was much more difficult and yet easy at the same time. It's confusing. Now, remember, I'm only talking about me and myself. So, all you would-be writers and stuff, you got to find this path yourself. And either you find it or you don't. Your style is your style. It's like that ubiquitous term, find your voice. Find your voice. I find that strange in some aspects because I always trouble me is what is my voice? What do they mean by my voice, my style of writing? Well, I still don't 100% understand what they think that should be. I personally believe that each individual character has their own voice, and those character voices overlap each other. And if they don't work well, it's just like the real world; they're not going to get along, and it's going to either be a boring conversation or a horrific fight. And nobody's going to really want to be around for it. It's going to be an uncomfortable fight. Now, if it's an entertaining fight and then everybody wants to gawk around and watch, stumbled onto something. Think about it for a minute, right? How much in the world do we want to observe other people's problems? That's one of the reasons people read. Not all of them. A lot of people read to escape their own problems by seeing somebody else overcome theirs or deal with theirs or what have you. Okay. There's going to be a lot of these rants as we go because I have a lot of different things I want to rant about or talk about, and my own experience in this journey of trying to get from idea to the bookstore shelf. We're not quite there yet. We're getting close. But we're not there yet. And writing my first novel, or in this particular novel that I'm working on, this is not the pre-planned thing. This is actually book 2 of a series. Potentially could be numerous 7, 8 novels in this series if my friend Shannon and I can continue collaborating on the project. Together, we created some really entertaining reading for ourselves. All I can hope is that other people will enjoy this stuff that we enjoyed after we've gone through the hard process of trimming the fat and polishing the prose, right? And that's tougher than it sounds. Like I said, I've been procrastinating something fierce, partly because of my current world issues and problems dealing with what we've had to deal with, and my conscience has been bugging me through this whole time that I'm somehow or another cheating myself or cheating the written word that's screaming and demanding to be put out there. I made some promises to myself and to my friend and to some other people, and by God, I'm 51 years old. I'm going to see I'm going to see this stuff through. It's not about money. I know. You're not all going to agree with that. A lot of people, and I've seen it. I've helped type other people's stuff before when their mindset was this was the $1 billion lottery win for them, and they were never going to have to work again in their life because this one book was going to be all that in a bag of chips. Well, friends, I'm sorry, but everything I've read in Writer's Digest and numerous of these how to write books and books by other authors on the subject of writing books all tell you the same story. Very few people make a huge living at you're not going to be the next J.K. Rowling or the next Stephen King. You might be, but you're not. If you want to make a career out of it, you need to be the next Woods or Kuntz, where you just crank these things out. You need to crank an average of 2 or 3 novels a year out to make a good living at it, and so you can sustain yourself in a comfortable setting in which you think you should win. If you think you're going to be the big, the big $1 million plus baby, good luck. Hey, maybe that's just it. You're the lightning before the thunder, as the most recent pop song or whatever the hell it is goes on about, and you'll get lucky. Lightning does strike, okay, but not for most of us. Most of us have to hammer at it, have to crawl and fight and growl and worry and procrastinate and bursts of brilliance all in one day or all in a year or 20 years, right? Okay. Over 20 minutes. I'm going to try to keep this under 30 because I know you guys is expensive. Most of you should, shut off after 5 minutes. I'm sorry. Okay. There's a book on the shelf, and I've read part of it but couldn't get through it. But I want to tell you a story about this particular writer. Call it inspiration or call it perseverance. I don't care. This particular writer is called, in a book, if I remember it correctly, Sacagawea or something to that effect. The bloody thing is this thick. As a paperback, it's this thick. And it's the only book by this lady, this author. This lady was in her 90s when it got published. She was in a nursing home. She had spent a big chunk of her life writing this thing. As a matter of fact, this thing was so much material that most of it never made it into the print. She had, if I remember the story I read in Writer's Digest, if that's where it was at, she cut a deal or got somebody's attention, and a publisher decided they wanted to look at her stuff. And her grandson wheeled in a dolly full of boxes. That was her novel. 4 or 5 good-sized boxes of stuff. That was the novel that turned into this almost 1,500, 2,000 page single book. And she spent a good chunk of her life writing it. All right? And there's other stories like that. Some that got published and some that don't. I think of another feller, but I'll talk to him about him on a different occasion. I'm sorry I don't remember the name of the author or the person. So, we talk about creating the books. My book is actually number 2, and because it's number 2, certain things that you wouldn't do in the first novel, you really can't or shouldn't do in the second novel. And I did it anyway. I started it out as, like I said, we was writing to entertain each other, and the story took off. And some of these characters screamed to be heard. Some of them didn't. My first novel was a mixture of love and hate because I had characters and I had an idea for a story, and I tried hard to keep them directed. It was like herding cats, and it's almost impossible. Not impossible, but darn near close. At some point, I threw the thing into a trash can and then later drug it back out because I knew I still had to finish this thing. I've started so many things in my life and never finished them. I had to finish this thing. And it became a thing, an obsession to make sure that I accomplished that particular goal, even if it never saw the light of day. I knew it was a beginning, a middle, and an end. When you go to do a second book, you don't need to worry about it being self-contained per se. If you know you're going to carry it over to a third book, you can write it to that in that mindset. You have to, or you can set the parameters for it. One of the troubles I had was writing book 1 was it just kept going. It kept going. There was so much more to be done, so much more to be said, and it's such a big dynamic that at one point I reached a section where I realized, geez, we've surpassed a 400-page novel and are approaching 500 or 600 easily with enough material to make it a 1,000-page book. At that point, I look at the stuff that I always read and the stuff I'm familiar with, and I realize we got to cut it off. We need to go back at some point and conclude book 1, and then carry over some of this other material to the foundation work for book 2. And at that same point, I wanted to tell a bigger story. I like the wheels inside of wheels, and sometimes when somebody ever, another one of these things that came up in on writing in the book On Writing Well, and several others, because I think some of them are mimicking stuff from some of these other how-to books, right? But there's a common thread that's good advice, and there's that. So, on the topic of having a goal in mind, you have to be able to acknowledge at some point an end, because if the book can't stand alone, then nobody's going to read the series. I mean, there's a potential. I mean, if the book series doesn't sell, the first book needs to stand alone by itself, because there may never be a second book, right? And one of the topics was, how do you explain your novel in as short a sentence as possible? If you have 11 seconds in an elevator to pitch an idea to an editor, what do you say? How do you describe this baby that you've spent so much time and effort trying to raise to somebody that may or, has only got a few seconds or a few minutes to give you an attention? If you can't hook them, they're likely to just nod their head, smile, give you a thumbs up, and keep right on rolling. So it's easier to plagiarize at that point. I argue, or I tell people, my game or my book, just like my game, is basically Game of Thrones set in space in the future. Well, that says a lot, but it doesn't tell you nothing about the story. What it does tell you is it's a complex space opera with a lot of dynamics going on, a lot of intergroup rivalry of some sort, with potential for a lot of people getting killed. Okay, so and that's the truth. All right, like I said, I'm running up on 30 minutes, so I'm going to do more videos of this subject because, well, I want to. And nobody reads it, or nobody visits, nobody sees it, nobody views it. I don't care. Sorry there, friends. I don't care. If you get something useful out of this, awesome. Great. It's the same reason I wrote the novels. I wrote them for me and my friend and my other friends. And hopefully the people who read them will enjoy them. And if they don't, then they're not for them. Right? I'm not writing for you. I'm not writing for Joe Q Public. The hell with Joe Q Public. Right? Most of Joe Q Public don't read anyway. They know what they want. I'm just saying. It's just like the genre. You're either into this stuff or you're not into this stuff. If you're not into this stuff, a million books isn't gonna make a bit of difference to you, because you're not gonna read any of them, right? So, first things first, write every day. Even if you throw it all away the next day, write. Even if you're writing stuff that isn't towards the original novel that you want to work. The key is to keep writing, keep motivated somehow, even if it's 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, and it's tough. That's where I got into procrastination stage. It's hard, right? So finding the time, dealing with the other people around you, the constant interruptions and diversions, and on and on and on. You know what? Here I am. I got an hour, a half hour. Bring me a notepad and start scribbling. I got my laptop with me. I can start typing. So, write. Second, write what you know. They all agree on that. All the books on writing stuff, write what you know. Don't try to write a story that you're not into, or a genre that you don't care about, or you have no familiarity with. I have no business writing mysteries or whodunits, because I don't like that stuff. I don't read it. True crime, thrillers, not me. I'm sorry. Now, I might incorporate a lot of that material into the science fiction or science fantasy stuff that I like to read and like to write. And I like to read enough that I've read several thousand of them in my lifetime. I've done the math. I've averaged it. I just, based off of the 400 or 500 novels I got sitting in boxes in storage, tell you right off the bat, and half of them I've read more than once. It's doable. So that's my thing, right? That's where I stopped mine. So that's where I started, and I write, and I do it for me. And I write every day, even if it's a little bit. Except when I procrastinate, I'm not gonna lie to you. It's hard. And I write what I know. I write what I know. I write for me. And maybe you.